In the depth of winter, when daylight surrenders early to encroaching darkness, there exists a peculiar psychological phenomenon that the ancients understood far better than we moderns dare admit. The alchemists, huddled in their dimly lit laboratories, spoke of a substance they called the prima materia, the base matter from which the philosopher's stone would eventually be forged. But this substance was not merely lead or sulfur or any common metal. It was, they whispered in their cryptic manuscripts, something far more elusive and infinitely more disturbing. It was the rejected, the despised, the carefully hidden aspects of the human soul that we spend our entire lives attempting to escape. The medieval masters encoded this truth in a paradox that has echoed through centuries. The treasure you seek is buried in the filth you most wish to avoid. Carl Jung, that peculiar Swiss physician who dared to map the interior territories where psychology meets mysticism, recognized in the alchemical texts something that his contemporaries dismissed as mere historical curiosity. He saw that the alchemists were not simply deluded proto-chemists fumbling toward modern chemistry. They were engaged in a far more radical project, one that operated simultaneously on two planes of existence. Yes, they worked with physical substances in their retorts and alembics, but the true laboratory was internal. The dissolution of metals in acid was simultaneously the dissolution of psychological structures. The purification of base matter through fire was the purification of consciousness through suffering. And the mysterious transmutation they sought, the transformation of lead into gold, represented nothing less than the integration of what Jung would later term the shadow, that repository of everything we have decided we are not. The shadow is not evil, though it contains what we have labeled as such. It is not simply our moral failures or our shameful impulses, though it certainly includes these. The shadow is the totality of psychic material that has been exiled from conscious awareness because it threatens the image we have constructed of ourselves. It is the unlived life, the unacknowledged desires, the qualities we have deemed incompatible with our social persona. The ambitious man shadows his path. In the depth of winter, when daylight surrenders early to encroaching darkness, there exists a peculiar psychological phenomenon that the ancients understood far better than we moderns dare admit. The alchemists, huddled in their dimly lit laboratories, spoke of a substance they called the prima materia, the base matter from which the philosopher's stone would eventually be forged. But this substance was not merely lead or sulfur or any common metal. It was, they whispered in their cryptic manuscripts, something far more elusive and infinitely more disturbing. It was the rejected, the despised, the carefully hidden aspects of the human soul that we spend our entire lives attempting to escape. The medieval masters encoded this truth in a paradox that has echoed through centuries. The treasure you seek is buried in the filth you most wish to avoid. Carl Jung, that peculiar Swiss physician who dared to map the interior territories where psychology meets mysticism, recognized in the alchemical texts something that his contemporaries dismissed as mere historical curiosity. He saw that the alchemists were not simply deluded proto-chemists fumbling toward modern chemistry. They were engaged in a far more radical project, one that operated simultaneously on two planes of existence. Yes, they worked with physical substances in their retorts and alembics, but the true laboratory was internal. The dissolution of metals in acid was simultaneously the dissolution of psychological structures. The purification of base matter through fire was the purification of consciousness through suffering. And the mysterious transmutation they sought, the transformation of lead into gold, represented nothing less than the integration of what Jung would later term the shadow, that repository of everything we have decided we are not. The shadow is not evil, though it contains what we have labeled as such. It is not simply our moral failures or our shameful impulses, though it certainly includes these. The shadow is the totality of psychic material that has been exiled from conscious awareness because it threatens the image we have constructed of ourselves. It is the unlived life, the unacknowledged desires, the qualities we have deemed incompatible with our social persona. The ambitious man shadows his passivity. The gentle woman shadows her rage. The rational intellectual shadows their irrationality. The spiritual seeker shadows their worldly hungers. What we refuse to recognize in ourselves does not disappear. It descends into the darkness of the unconscious, where it accumulates power and takes on a life of its own. The alchemists understood this descent with remarkable precision. Their texts describe the first stage of the great work as the nigredo, the blackening, a phase of putrefaction and decay that must precede any authentic transformation. This was not metaphorical flourish. It was a phenomenological description of what occurs when consciousness first confronts the contents of the shadow. The encounter is experienced as a kind of death, a dissolution of the carefully maintained boundaries that define the ego's sense of itself. Everything one believed about their nature, their goodness, their identity, begins to decompose. The person who has prided themselves on kindness discovers reservoirs of cruelty. The one who has built an identity around strength confronts their profound vulnerability. The self-proclaimed lover of truth faces their capacity for self-deception. This is the nigredo, and it is as nauseating and disorienting as any physical decay. The medieval texts are explicit about the dangers of this phase. They warn that the work can drive the practitioner to madness, that many who begin the opus never complete it, destroyed by the very forces they attempted to transform. This was not empty dramatic license. The confrontation with the shadow represents a genuine psychological crisis, a dark night in which the structures that have organized consciousness threaten to collapse entirely. The temptation to flee this darkness is overwhelming. The psyche offers 1,000 escape routes: spiritual bypass, projection onto others, regression into previous patterns, addiction, psychosis. The alchemists knew that most who glimpsed the prima materia would recoil in horror and seal it away more completely than before. But for those who persist, who maintain what the texts call the hermetic seal, preventing the volatile contents from escaping, while also not allowing consciousness to flee from them, something extraordinary begins to occur. This is where the alchemical wisdom becomes most subtle and most profound. The shadow material, held in the crucible of awareness without being acted upon or repressed, begins to undergo a transformation that cannot be forced. The alchemists called this phase the albedo, the whitening, a gradual clarification that follows the darkness of the nigredo. Psychologically, this represents the beginning of differentiation within the previously undifferentiated mass of shadow content. What had appeared as a monolithic darkness begins to reveal distinct elements, each carrying its own energy and message. The rage that seemed simply destructive reveals itself as righteous anger at violations of boundaries never properly defended. The shame that felt like evidence of fundamental unworthiness transforms into appropriate remorse that can motivate genuine change. The desire that appeared as mere lust discloses itself as the life force that has been systematically denied. The fear that seemed like cowardice proves to be wisdom about real dangers that consciousness had been too proud to acknowledge. Each element of the shadow, when truly seen rather than merely glimpsed and rejected, contains information essential to wholeness. This is where Jung's reading of alchemy becomes most radical. He recognized that the shadow does not simply contain negative qualities requiring integration. It contains gold, actual psychological gold in the form of unrealized potentials, creative energies that were repressed, along with the problematic material because consciousness lacked the sophistication to separate them. The child who was punished for their anger learned to repress not only destructive rage, but also healthy assertion. The adolescent, shamed for their sexuality, learn to exile not only inappropriate desire, but also passionate engagement with life. The young adult who internalized messages about appropriate ambition learn to suppress not only grandiosity, but also legitimate aspiration. The shadow is a treasure house of abandoned parts of the self that were rejected not because they were intrinsically problematic, but because the environment could not accommodate them. The alchemists depicted this hidden treasure in images of astonishing consistency across different times and cultures. They drew the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, hidden in dung heaps. They illustrated the crowned king imprisoned in the darkness of matter. They described the gold concealed within the most despised and rejected substances. These were not merely colorful metaphors. They were precise phenomenological descriptions of what one encounters in deep shadow work, that the most valuable aspects of the personality are often those that have been most thoroughly rejected and disguised. But the integration of shadow material is not a simple process of acceptance or a facile exercise in self-affirmation. The alchemists were explicit that their work required fire, sustained heat applied over long periods. Psychologically, this fire represents the tension of holding consciousness steady in the presence of previously rejected material without collapsing back into identification with either the ego ideal or the shadow itself. It is the heat of sustained awareness, the burning focus of attention that does not flinch away from discomfort. This is exhausting work that cannot be rushed. The texts speak of the opus requiring months or years, of the necessity of repeating operations, of the ease with which the work can be contaminated or corrupted if proper procedure is not maintained. The integration process, which the alchemists associated with the later stages of citrinitas and rubedo, the yellowing and reddening, involves a gradual incorporation of shadow material into conscious functioning. This does not mean acting out every rejected impulse or sanctifying every hidden desire. It means developing the psychological sophistication to hold conflicting energies simultaneously without immediate resolution. The integrated individual can acknowledge their capacity for cruelty while choosing compassion, can feel rage while maintaining relationship, can recognize selfish impulses while acting with generosity. The opposites are not eliminated, but held in a creative tension that generates psychological flexibility and depth. Jung called this the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to create a third position that transcends the binary opposition between conscious and unconscious, ego and shadow, good and evil. The alchemists referred to it as the conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites, often depicted as the sacred marriage between sun and moon, king and queen, masculine and feminine. This union does not occur through the victory of one pole over another, but through their mutual transformation in relationship. The conscious ego is fundamentally altered by its encounter with the shadow, becoming more humble, more complex, less certain of its righteousness. Simultaneously, the shadow material is transformed by being brought into relationship with consciousness, losing its autonomous and often destructive character. This transformation manifests in observable ways. The person who has done genuine shadow work develops what might be called psychological depth. They become less reactive, less defensive, more capable of sitting with ambiguity and uncertainty. They lose interest in projection, that universal mechanism by which we see in others what we cannot acknowledge in ourselves. The colleague who infuriated them with their passivity is recognized as carrying a disowned aspect of their own nature. The public figure they despised for their grandiosity is seen as manifesting an energy they have been too ashamed to claim. The recognition does not eliminate judgment or discernment, but it removes the emotional charge, the obsessive quality that characterizes projection. There is also a notable shift in one's relationship to suffering. The person in the midst of shadow work often experiences intensified psychological pain as previously repressed material rises to consciousness. But over time, a different relationship to suffering emerges. It is no longer something to be immediately escaped or medicated or spiritualized away. It becomes information, a signal from the depths that something is seeking recognition and integration. The alchemists understood that their work was inherently painful, that the dissolution and reconstruction of the personality could not occur without the fire of suffering. But they also recognized that this suffering was purposeful, generative, fundamentally different from the repetitive suffering of neurosis or the meaningless suffering of random trauma. The ethical implications of shadow integration are profound and often unsettling. The person who has genuinely confronted their own capacity for darkness becomes less judgmental but not more permissive, more compassionate but not more naive. They develop what Jung called moral realism, the recognition that evil is not something that exists only in others, but a permanent possibility within every human psyche, including their own. This does not lead to moral relativism, but to a more grounded ethics, one based not on the repression of dangerous impulses, but on the conscious choice to not act upon them despite their presence. The person who knows they are capable of cruelty, but chooses kindness, exercises a different order of virtue than the person who believes they have transcended such base impulses. This brings us to perhaps the most challenging aspect of the shadow's gold, what Jung called the problem of the integrated personality. The person who has done this work often finds themselves alienated from both conventional morality and from the shadows of the collective. They can no longer participate unquestioningly in the moral certainties of their community, having recognized how much shadow material is carried by collective ideals and institutions. The nation that proclaims its goodness while projecting evil onto enemies. The religious community that preaches love while harboring pools of unacknowledged hatred. The family system that maintains its appearance of harmony through the scapegoating of one member. The integrated individual sees through these mechanisms with painful clarity. Yet they also cannot find refuge in rebellious identification with the collective shadow, in the romantic glorification of the outcast or the systematic rejection of conventional values. They recognize that the rebel who defines themselves against society is as bound to the collective as the conformist, merely occupying the opposite pole of the same dynamic. The truly individuated person stands alone, responsible for their own moral decisions, unable to rely on either conventional morality or its systematic rejection to guide their choices. This is a lonely position, one that the alchemical texts acknowledged in their insistence that the work could only be done in isolation, in the sealed vessel of individual consciousness. But the gold that emerges from this solitary work is not only personal. The alchemists maintained that their operation, though performed by a single individual in a solitary laboratory, had cosmic significance. The transformation of base matter into gold was simultaneously the redemption of matter itself, the liberation of spirit, trapped in the darkness of material existence. Jung recognized in this belief a profound psychological truth, that individual shadow integration has collective consequences. Each person who withdraws their projections, who ceases to unconsciously dump their darkness onto others, who learns to hold their own conflicts without splitting the world into absolute good and absolute evil, reduces the total quantity of unconscious material operating in the collective psyche. This is not the same as the naive optimism that suggests individual healing will automatically heal the world. The world contains genuine evil, structural injustice, collective shadow material that cannot be dissolved through individual work alone. But the person who has integrated their own shadow brings a fundamentally different quality of presence to collective challenges. They are less susceptible to manipulation through fear and hatred. They can resist the seductive pull of scapegoating and projection. They can hold complexity without collapsing into binary thinking. They become what Jung called a carrier of consciousness, someone who increases the total quantity of awareness available to the collective. The completion of the alchemical opus, if it can be said to be complete at all, does not produce a perfect individual, but a whole one. The gold that emerges from the work is not the elimination of base qualities, but their transformation through integration. The person who has done this work does not become a saint. They become themselves in all their complexity and contradiction. They retain their capacity for darkness, but are no longer ruled